You'll see them in the top left-hand corner there, Yvonne and Bob Houghton. Yvonne has been a pagan since 1985 and a Wiccan since 1991. She's got a Master of Arts degree in Contemporary Religions and Spiritualities from Bath Spa University and lives in Cambridge, Ontario. She has written 4 books on the mythology and folklore of trees, birds, animals, and 2 anthologies of poetry. Her most recent books are Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Light's Journey, Witchcraft as Transformation. Both of those are now going into their 2nd editions. She also blogs at Dowsing for Divinity. And turning to Bob, our co-presenter, Bob Houghton has been a pagan since 1975 and a Wiccan since 2004. He's got an academic background in history, television, and cinema, and he has given Morris dancing workshops in Canada, Ireland, the Netherlands, and England. His interest in Morris dancing dates back to 2003, and he's posted many videos on his YouTube channel, Lumiere CDN. They're going to be talking tonight about folk magic. Going to take questions at the end for this one, purely because if people start posting them in chat, it's extremely distracting with the number of people that we've got on tonight. So, on that note, Yvonne, Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Emlyn.
Hello. Well, where shall we begin?
Well, apparently we should share the screen.
Okay, we're going to put up a PowerPoint here. Share screen right there.
Share that. And
share and there.
Yeah, you might recognize this graphic. There we go.
Okay. So folk magic. Now, I was kind of new to folk magic the first time we were invited to a session up in, was it up in Essex or up in Norfolk?
Yeah, Norfolk.
Norfolk. And I found it absolutely fascinating because I thought, how different is it going to be from the magic that I've been learning about over the last few years? And it got me thinking, what is that? What is my definition of magic? You could all ponder that thought while I'm speaking now. What is your definition of magic? You can take pieces from nature around you. You can take old Disney films, fairy tales. The younger people probably watch Buffy, so they get an idea of what magic was like, or from literature. So let's look at what some of the practitioners of magic have said, which to describe what it is. Probably one of the most famous would be Aleister Crowley. He said that science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Now I'm going to pair that with Scott Cunningham's, but I'll show you the reason in a minute. Scott Cunningham said magic is the projection of natural energies to produce needed effect. Now we go over to Starhawk and Dion Fortune. Dion Fortune said, magic is the art of changing consciousness at will. And Starhawk said the art of sensing and shaping the subtle. Isn't it interesting that the men want to change physical reality and the women want to change the spiritual or the mental reality?
I also think it's really interesting that Starhawk has probably come up with 20 or 30 different definitions of magic over her writing career, and she tends to shift from the metaphorical to the more literal, influencing physical reality. So take your pick as to the quote you want to choose.
Okay, so now we move on to what is folk magic.
Oh, sorry. Oh, my bad. Oh, you're back.
That's why I said use that.
Yes, okay, good idea. Sorry about that. Anyway, you got a nice preview of the next slide. So I want to share a quote with you from W.B. Yeats, which is about the mythopoeic worldview, the view that everything is enchanted. Once every people in the world believed that trees were divine and could take a human or grotesque shape and dance among the shadows, and that deer and ravens and foxes and wolves and bears and clouds and pools, almost all things under the sun and the sun and moon were not less divine and changeable. They saw in the rainbow the still bent bow of a god thrown down in his negligence. They heard in the thunder the sound of his beaten water jar, or the tumult of his chariot wheels. And when a sudden flight of wild duck or crows passed over their heads, they thought they were gazing at the dead hastening to their rest, while they dreamed of so great a mystery in little things that they believed the waving of a hand or of a sacred bough enough to trouble far-off hearts or hoot the moon with darkness. And if that doesn't thrill your heart with the joy of the animist mythopoeic worldview, then, well, there you go. But I for me, that really, like this whole thing, you know, Tim was talking last week about the animist worldview and how everything is alive and has agency and a spirit. And really that is the basis of folk magic, that's the case. So bear that in mind as we talk throughout this.
Okay, another word we're going to be using is spellcraft. Spellcraft being something that you learn, something that is passed down through your family or through the tradition. And that word can be used interchangeably with magic, but more in relation to folk magic. And spellcraft can be found amongst the magical traditions and indigenous cultures of every country on Earth. For the desire to cast spells simply represents the innate human desire to influence circumstances. Since the earliest times, when people were ill or poverty-stricken, robbed or deceived, yearning for a lover or longing for a better home or a bounteous crop, they turned to spell makers in an effort to either make their dreams come true or to punish their enemies. That is directly out of Philip Carr-Gomm and Richard Haygate's book, The Book of English Magic, which is an interesting read. Put that on your list. So traditional or folk magic could be thought of as belonging to the realm of those who have little or no power of their own. People who could use their social influence to change, or people who couldn't use their social influence to change what was happening around them. And they were the people who secretly used other means. This has been going on for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years. You'd think that in the modern and urban or secular world, magic wouldn't hold much appeal to people, but perhaps it is for those same very reasons that it has shown a resurgence. So it's good that in recent years, many people have started looking at the background to spellcraft and investigating the inner work required to do it. Let's look at some of the traditional tools used in folk magic and how they might or can be used in your practice.
So I think the reason that magic and paganism as a whole have enjoyed a resurgence in the late 19th and 20th century into the 21st century is because of our alienation from the natural world caused by industrialization. And
well, living in big cities,
yeah,
feel detached from nature.
Yeah.
And nature's at the core of magic.
What's happened to it? Look at it.
Oops, somebody's not got their microphone muted.
Well, nobody's used the tips, so how would it?
Emlyn, can you mute all participants? Yeah.
I'm just trying to find them.
Yeah.
Trying to find them.
Yeah.
It was in the hall on the side.
Still going.
There we go.
I think that's it done now.
Excellent. Okay, can you hear us?
Yeah, you're not
Okay,
muted.
Okay. That's good. Okay, just thought we'd check that. Yeah. The three most uttered things in the age of COVID. Can you all see my screen? Am I muted? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the key things in trying to control the world around you is the ability to measure time and record events. Because if you want to predict events, you have to observe and record events that have happened in the past. And in order to do that, you need a way of measuring time. And the object that is displayed on the screen is a primstave or clog almanac. And primstave is the Scandinavian name for them, and clog almanac is what they're generally called in Britain. And clog in this context doesn't mean a shoe, it just means a piece of wood. So what would be marked on these would be moon phases, the tides of the day, the tides of the year, and these markers would, each of these little symbols on the, and I'll hopefully move my mouse pointer, I hope you can see that. Each of these little symbols along the edge represents a particular festival that would be around the year, and so they would,
Each of the marks would be a day.
yeah, and then each of the little grooves on the edge is a day. So this is a drawing of the sides of a Norwegian primstave, and you can see it's quite ornate that they've carved little symbols for each of the different festivals. And they've also got numbers next to them for the dates. So I think the it's hard to tell what festivals they represent, but I actually use, I don't know if you can see that, I have to move that out of the way. These are the 8 symbols on the right hand side that I've just brought up, the symbols of the pagan festivals of the Wheel of the Year. And I thought our screen had frozen there. On the next slide, here they are around a more conventional year wheel and with the relevant festivals marked on them. So Yule looks a bit like a dolmen with some rays of light coming through it. Imbolc is maybe a sunrise or something. Spring equinox has always looked to me a bit like a space hopper, if you remember those from the 1970s. But I think it's actually a seed. I think it's actually a seed sprouting. And Beltane is like maybe a tree or a plant growing. Midsummer, not sure, looks a bit like the sign of Leo. Lammas might be a sunset, or it might be a bow, like a bow and arrow. Autumn equinox is a wilting plant, and Samhain is a spirit trap, which is a traditional design used to distract spirits and get them basically going like this, so they don't come and bother you. And in the center of the circle, we have the 4 tides of the year, and so the resting tide runs from Samhain to Imbolc, and it's the time of year when the seeds are resting in the ground and not really doing much, but maybe germinating. And people stay indoors and do crafts and generally, hang out by the fire. The cleansing tide, which runs from Imbolc to Beltane and takes in the month of February, which the Romans named Februarensis because it literally means cleansing. It's basically a time of the year when there's frosts, which kill off disease and insects and whatnot, and it's when you do spring cleaning. Growing tide from Beltane to Lammas is what we're in now. Yes, it's when all the plants come up, and like before that you get buds on things, and there's a few flowers that are like early. In Canada, basically it's snowy until just before Beltane anyway, so like there ain't any growing going on. We're definitely still in the cleansing tide in Canada at that point. And then suddenly, in Canada at Beltane, everything just goes boom, and you've suddenly got plants everywhere. And
very dramatic.
It's very dramatic. Like when it's spring, it really means like spring actually goes boing out of the ground. And then we have the so the growing tide is very noticeable in Canada, and the reaping tide. So you have 3 harvests in the reaping tide. The first is Lammas, which is the harvest of corn and wheat. Autumn equinox, which is the harvest of fruits. And Samhain, which is when traditionally people would have killed off and salted down their surplus cattle, and would have so that's the harvest of meat in effect.
Get you ready for the winter.
Yeah, so these tides and the festivals associated with them are mostly based on the British climate, and they don't necessarily fit in other parts of the world. So if you live in Australia, for example, Australians swap them round so that you've got basically swap Yule and Midsummer and swap autumn equinox and spring equinox, and the other ones kind of stay the same, or they just rotate it all by 6 months. Depends on the coven. But good book about that, Witches Evolved by Julia Phillips. But yeah, I mean, there's not much point trying to maintain the British associations of these festivals in a completely different climate. Anyway, thought I'd mention that. Yeah, next one. I'm trying to get to the next slide. Here we go. Okay, so the other way of measuring time that people had, so before sundials, before clocks, obviously, what you would do is you would have, so we've got a diagram here with the farm in the middle, and it's meant to be in Norway. So this farm is surrounded by mountains, and the top rectangle here is the view at midday. So you look over towards that direction, and hang on, yes, that would be in the south, and the sun is in the south, and it's over this mountain here. So therefore, that's you note that mountain is where the sun is at midday, and maybe you have a marker on the ground to indicate that that's your midday point. Yes. Then we have undawn, which is sort of mid-afternoon, and that has that also has a time of day when it's a mountain that the sun is over at that time of day, and so on all the way around the circle. And of course, if you're in Norway, the sun only sets for about an hour in the summer. So like I used to live in Scotland, and the sun was up for 22 hours a day at midsummer. It was pretty amazing.
Like when I lived in Edmonton, it was the same sort of thing.
Yeah. So anyway, hopefully you get the idea of that. But basically, that people would put marks around on the landscape to correspond to the hills where the sun was at any particular time of day, and then they would use that to tell the time. And so they divided the day into equal parts of 3 hours each, like this. And so these tides of the day were in use in Wales, England, most of Scandinavia, and I guess Ireland, but I can't remember if it was in Ireland, but definitely Wales and England and most of Scandinavia. So these are the English names for them. If you look online, and also in the books of Nigel Pennick, you can find the Welsh and Norwegian names for them as well. So each of these tides of the day has a particular quality associated with it. And when I looked at the list of qualities, I was like, well, those are basically the activities you would do at that time of day. So obviously at morn tide, that's when you leap out of bed and go and milk the cows, because they won't wait. And then day tide is, all right, I'm going to go back to the house and have some breakfast now. And midday, oh, it must be time for lunch. And undawna or undrun tide is the afternoon. Also the name of an excellent album by the Medieval Babes, in case you were wondering where you'd heard that word before. And then we go eventide, night tide, midnight, and ucht or uchtentide. And obviously uchtentide is the very low ebb where most deaths occur. So that was when people had the most portentous dreams and so on. So but yeah, the reason this was a good system of time was that because it was based on equal portions of 3 hours each, and you didn't need to be that precise in the age of before railways and all that sort of thing. Whereas the monastic hour system, which is used in some magical systems, which is an astrological thing, was developed in the Mediterranean. Now, in the Mediterranean, the day length stays pretty much the same all year round. So you can get away with saying, right, I'm going to divide the daylight into equal hours and the night into a set of equal hours, because the day length and the night length is not going to change. Whereas in the further north you go, the more the day length fluctuates around the year. So you need to have your day divided up into equal portions, regardless of whether it's dark or not. So that's why this system fits the northern part of the Northern Hemisphere better. Okay.
Okay, so now we've got the accounting for the year, we've got the accounting for the seasons, we've got the accounting for the hours of the day, we've got all that is set in place. Now you're looking at your Primstave and you're seeing things that are coming up. You want to predict why things are going to happen, why things have happened. And this is where the magic part of it comes in. Now, divination, which is one of the two things we're going to look at here, it's more of a passive magic. You want to find out why things have happened, why they haven't happened. And as a practice, this was normally tolerated a little better by the church and the courts than active magic, which will be what we'll talk about next. So what is divination? So predicting. How would you predict the future? What would you do? There are methods of using cards. You spread out a deck of cards, you split them. It's random. What's a good definition of it? Random choice.
Yeah.
And each card will tell a part of a story, which can be read into what has happened, what will happen now, or what will happen in the future.
Yeah.
And it's up to the person reading the cards to have the skill to interpret those things.
Or what will happen in the future based on your current choices.
Yeah, what potentially could happen in the future. Another way is by reading tea leaves. Now, these are having cards around the house, having teapots around the house. These are all normal things that wouldn't stand out necessarily. So reading tea leaves, again, you're interpreting the subtle patterns in the bottom of the cup of tea and looking for messages. A little more active would be the runes, which runes are an archaic alphabet, which are not only phonic, but also each character expresses a concept. And when you pull them randomly and lay them down, again, they will tell a story to somebody who is trained in how to read them. Reading bones. This is similar to reading tea leaves, where you shake them up and toss them and then read patterns into them. I was at a pub once with a friend and we just finished a couple of pints of beer and a whole package of chicken wings. And she had the bowl with all the bones in it and just flipped it over and dropped it on the table. The staff were very confused. But anyway, it was an interesting lesson. And then there's astrology, which probably takes the most training of all of these. And it's much more in depth. Now you've got astrology based on the hour and day and location of your birth, or you can also do astrology based on a particular time, depending on whether you want to read what could potentially happen in the future or just a natal chart telling about your own life.
Or the hidden causes of a particular event.
Yeah.
So what were the astrological influences at the point when a significant event happened, like the inauguration of a new president, or the beginning of a monarch's reign, or something like that?
Okay, another thing, which is more, there'd always be somebody in the village who would do this. Water divining, dowsing. This is finding things that are invisible or hidden. I've heard stories of farmers who were devout members of the local church, and they would call in the water diviner to find where they should dig their well. And they had no problem with this because it was, again, for their benefit. So that's one way of finding things that are missing or lost. Another would be using a pendulum, where you will hold it and it will naturally either spin in circles or in straight lines. You have to ask initially what is, say yes, and then say no, and then you can interpret from that, and then you ask the question you're looking for. It's an interesting thing to play with too. Scrying, again, looking for subtle patterns, but through the subconscious or the third eye, and I'm absolutely rubbish at this.
Yeah, me too. I'm terrible at scrying.
And then finding, why do people do this? Well, they're trying to find the cause of things. Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my family? Why did the crops not come up? Why did this person become sick? How come we can't have, how come this person can't have children? These are all questions that people would ask. And they would turn to the wise woman or the cunning man in the village, and they would be the practitioners of occult magic. So now we get into a little more active use of magic. The controlling of events, where you will use the mental and to change the physical world around you. This was not as well looked upon by the church and the courts, and people would occasionally get into trouble. Depending on where you were, it could be very bad. So let's see, wind magic, wind and weather. Sailors could definitely benefit from this. When I was younger, I used to go sailing with my dad, and he always had this saying, if you were becalmed, whistle for the wind. And we'd do that, and sooner or later the wind would come up, and we'd think we'd done something magical. But people used to make knot spells, and for each knot, they would call upon the wind. And they would then sell these to sailors and say, if you're having trouble, if there's no wind, undo one of the knots and it'll come. So they're selling wind, they're selling magic to the sailors. And for weather, we haven't had any rain for, last week was extremely dry here, and it was up into the 30s. So it would have been nice to have a little rain spell. We did a workshop once on weather magic, and they were always saying, remember that if you say, I want rain, it may be to the detriment of somebody else. So you have to be very specific in what you ask for, which is probably why you would turn to somebody who's good at doing this for any sort of weather magic. Or you've got the fertility of your animals, your crops, or the people around you. Magical spells to bring about new calves, to bring the crops up, for people to have more children.
Yeah. Worth mentioning that anybody can do fertility magic. You don't need two heterosexuals to do fertility magic. You can do it whatever gender or sexual orientation you are.
Well, fertility means more than that.
You're showing the thing what to do, so it doesn't matter if you are literally fertile yourself or likely to produce actual fertility. Yeah, well, the point is, it's showing the thing what to do.
There's a Wiccan festival in this area every year, and many years ago, a couple came and they couldn't have children. They'd almost given up on it. And so some of the elder women at the festival got together. They couldn't stop. Last count, I believe, last time they were up here, there were 5 kids.
Wow.
So yes, they turned to the right source there. Now, protection, another thing. How many of you probably heard of the New Forest witches doing their ritual to keep the Germans and Hitler from invading England during the Second World War? Now, they believed that they were the reincarnations of another group that had done the same thing. It was either in the Spanish Armada or it was Napoleon, to keep Napoleon from invading England. And there is also some talk that this was done to keep the Spanish Armada from invading England, because an unexpected storm came up that nobody had predicted, and it basically wrecked most of their fleet.
Mm.
And then we have another way of controlling events is be communicating with animals. You'd be speaking to the birds or possibly spirits, speaking with your ancestors, the dead.
Mm-hmm. That's the next slide.
Yes, which,
Mm-hmm.
oh, yes, and for protection, what do you want protection against? Stinging nettles in the garden today.
Mm.
Yes, you could have used that. From wounds, from animals, from snakes, snake bites, you don't want that. Or possibly from other magical users.
Mm.
So over to you, Yvonne,
Oh,
on
okay.
that subject. I'll switch the slide.
Yeah, that's good.
There we go.
Yeah, so on the subject of snake bite, in Italy they have this amazing dance called the tarantella, which is literally that if somebody gets bitten by a tarantula, they do this very frenetic dance, and it's meant to get rid of the venom of the spider from their system. That's what the tarantella is. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so chants and spells. These are the bread and butter of magic in general and folk magic in particular. They're very important, especially in Western magic because, or European magic, because we're a very wordy culture and we like our chants and spells. Another thing that was really important was talismans and amulets. And amulets are worn by people as a form of protection and defense against evil. So an amulet is just a protective item, could be a representation of a deity or a saint or something, and that protects you against any bad stuff that's coming at you. Whereas a talisman is to enhance your power. So examples of talismans could be King Arthur's sword Excalibur, or Aladdin's magic lamp, or some sort of magic rod, or a magic hat. Those are all talismans, and they are worn to instill power, confidence, and in those that wear them, and they're believed to enhance personal power. So that's the key difference between those two things. Some of the traditional ones that people used in folk magic would be rowan twigs and berries. These were traditional against malefic magic, such as ill-wishing or bewitching somebody in a bad way. Using brambles and thorns, sometimes called sprite flails. And if you want to make a magical barrier, you get a nice long piece of bramble and you stick it over your doorways in your house, and the spiky quality is basically that's what keeps the spirits or the nasties away. So that's kind of similar to what Tim was saying about how magic works, in that he was saying that the thing remembers. It has brambles have a quality of being spiky that keeps livestock and people away, and therefore it also keeps spiritual entities, negative spiritual entities and influences away too, because that's the quality of bramble that is spiky. Another one that's really important is sigils and signs, and if you look at the have an example of a sigil here on the slide, which was made by Laura Tempest Zakroff in 2016, and it is basically for protection against the Trump regime, and hopefully it's doing its work. Since then, she's made a lot of other really great sigils and signs, and she's got a really great book about sigil magic. But I don't want to encroach too much on Kevin's talk next time. So, oh, excuse me, should have got some water. Another important tool in the folk magic arsenal is the witch bottle. Hopefully you can see this. Sorry, there we go. This is a witch bottle, and it's basically a jar or a bottle with lots of colourful threads in it, And oh, thank you, darling. And basically the idea of the threads is that they distract the spirits, rather like the spirit trap sigil. The spirit literally kind of sits there going, "Oh, pretty, oh," a bit like somebody looking at a fruit machine in a pub. Ooh.
That's why they put them there.
That's why they put them there. So yeah, those are very important. And another use of witch bottles, I recently read a really interesting book called Making Witches, and it's about witchcraft in Newfoundland, which is a large island off the coast of Canada for anybody with who is geographically challenged. And in Newfoundland, people would, and this is probably true in Ireland, and because most of the people in Newfoundland came from Devon, Ireland, and also Jersey and Scotland. So they had a thing where they'd somehow manage to collect a bottle of urine from the intended victim. And I don't really want to think about how. And they would take this bottle of urine and they would smoke it in the fire, and the victim would then, who was alleged to have bewitched the person that was doing this to them, which was why they were doing it, and they were doing it to torment the witch so that she would take the spell off of them. Anyway, this would render the alleged witch unable to pee, and so she would then lift the spell, and then they would empty the witch bottle out, and all would be well again. There are actual recorded cases of doctors in Newfoundland getting people coming to them with an inability to pee and saying, "Well, I think somebody might have smoked a bottle at you. Do you think that's a possibility?" So that's quite an interesting one. Another very traditional in many cultures is the use of a red thread around your wrist to protect from malevolent entities. And I believe it's in Indonesia, when you have a newborn child, they have a red thread around their wrist, and that protects the child from being stolen by the fairies or similar. And the whole red thread around the wrist thing is very prevalent across a number of different cultures. Another one for protective magic is the use of eggs. So basically, if you're trying to lift a curse off of somebody, you redirect. This is pretty advanced stuff, so like probably a good idea to hire a professional curse lifter, which is not me, by the way. I do not have expertise in this area. Anyway, you take an egg and you direct the curse into the egg, and then you bury it somewhere very far away from where there are likely to be people who will come across it. And that will hopefully lift the curse from the victim and also prevent it from becoming attached to you instead. Quite important. Okay, threshold guardians. People, obviously, thresholds are a very magical thing because they are the way that other people and entities can gain access into your space. So it's important to have guards set up on your thresholds, and these could be pentagrams, these could be special protective patterns, they can be objects buried in the threshold like a shoe, and also people would bury stuff in the walls. Quite often witch bottles have been found in fireplaces and in walls, and also people would bury shoes in the wall, and unfortunately not to be revived, people would also bury cats in walls, which I think is horrific. And people would also make protective items. You pass me this. Yeah, this is This is known in some cultures as a Bridget's cross, and in other cultures it's known as a ojo de Dios. Yeah. Oh yeah. Hope people can see our camera as well as the slides. There we go.
Building it to be a bit of meditative practice too, because as you're doing it, you can keep something in mind to empower it.
Yeah. There you go. And also in Turkey, they have these guys, the Nazar Boncuk. There you go. Which protects against the evil eye. So, and if you hang one of these and it breaks, then it means that it's done its work, and somebody glanced at your thing that you're protecting with an envious gaze, and basically that's why it shattered, and then you just need a new one. So it did its work. Okay, yeah, next slide. So another really important aspect of folk magic is, of course, once something bad has happened, you might need some healing. So people would do herbal medicine, tinctures dissolving the herb or drug in alcohol, tisanes, which would be a herbal tea, so you steep the herb in hot water, powders, grind up the herb or the root to make a powder that could be put into water and drunk, and also pills, which were traditionally rolled to get the medicine into the pill.
That's why you have to get to know your plants.
Yes, and quite often charms and spells were recited while you were preparing the herbs or other ingredients. And there is a surviving manuscript of an Anglo-Saxon book called the Lachnunga or Leech Book, which contains rather famous charms like the 9 herbs charm and with Ferstika, which means against a sudden stabbing pain. And also there was a folklorist in the 19th century who went around the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, Alexander Carmichael, and he collected the Carmina Gadelica, which is a collection of chants and prayers. So that's a good source of stuff. We've already mentioned sympathetic magic, which is showing the thing what to do. Contagious magic, the transfer of qualities from one object to another. And the animist style of magic that Tim was describing in the last talk. Dream incubation is important in many cultures. In Lydney, in the Forest of Dean, there is a temple of Nodens, which was a dream incubation. One of the functions of that temple was dream incubation for healing. So basically the person would go into a special room and they would have a dream, and the dream would be the key to healing their illness. In India, they use songs and stories to heal people of various illnesses, quite often mental health issues. And many cultures have a magical quest. So, for example, there are folk tales which say, okay, the woman went to the village wise man and he told her to go on a magical quest, and it was very difficult, and then she came back and it showed, and that gave her the answer. So and of course, not to forget laying on of hands, which is the transmission of magical healing energy directly into the person. And another example of that would be Reiki, of course, which was a relatively modern development. Okay, why can't I get to the next one? Oh, yeah. Okay. So can't think of a neat segue from the last topic to this one. So there you go. Very important in folk magic is the topic of shapeshifting. Probably familiar with the rhyme, I shall go into the hair with sorrow and sich and mickle care. I shall go in the devil's name, aye, till I come home again. And that is from Isabel Gowdy, the Scottish witch who was tried in 1662. Probably worth mentioning that in folkloric witchcraft, the devil is not the same entity as the Christian guy with the same name, the survival of the horned god, basically, among other things. So yes, we see, so the thing about shapeshifting is that it's a form of therianthropy, which you can see in legends about werewolves and people shifting into all kinds of different animals. There are many folk tales where somebody shoots a deer or a hare, but only wings it and wounds it in the leg, and then like, next day they see the local witch limping because she's got a wound in the exact same leg, and it's because that witch had shapeshifted into that animal and was shot whilst in the shape of the animal. Terry Pratchett puts forward the idea that what's actually happening there is not that the witch has literally shapeshifted into the animal, but that the witch has transferred their consciousness into the animal and is riding the animal. And in Terry Pratchett's books, it's called borrowing. So that's an interesting one. And whilst we're on the subject of animals, that leads us neatly to familiars and spirits.
Yes, and back over to me.
Yes.
Familiars and spirits. Well, we've got, how many of you think about spirits around your home? Now, in the time when your parents would have a house which would then be left to you, and you would leave that house to your children, you would have these familiar spirits. They would be following your family, your familiar. And in ancient Roman times, they were referred to as the lares, which were the spirits of the hearth. And there were also the penates, which were the spirits of the food cupboard. There is a tradition amongst the Scots and the English to have something referred to as house brownies. Don't really know that much about house brownies.
Okay, I can talk about house brownies.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So basically, the house brownie was a spirit that lived in your house that did chores for you if you left offerings for it on the hearth. And that's why brownies, the junior guides, are called brownies.
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
Yeah.
No, and then in Slavic cultures, there were the domovoi, who were seen as ancestral spirits and actually lived in the stove. That would be awfully hot.
Yeah. It's the warmest place in the house.
Yes. So it was the hearth where you honored the spirits of your ancestors. It was a central place for rituals and to make offerings or to ask for protection or fruitfulness in domestic matters. If you had a statue to embody the spirit, it could be brought from the hearth to the table so they could have a meal with you, and they would receive the offerings at that point of bread, of beer. Few people today would have hearths, wood-burning stoves in the house. Some people do, but in its place, you would build a shrine where you would have candle burning, something that would take the place of the hearth. Now, we've also got nature spirits, which are the spirits of the world around you. So we have people today on this chat who are from many different continents, many different countries, and would have different local land spirits that they would get to know if they're doing a practice there. And but would you recognize them? Would you work with them? Bless you. In folk magic, they would be your helpers. They'd be your intermediaries in performing spells and getting the outcome you desire. And then pets and familiars. We have two of them wandering around here right now, two cats. Many people think of familiars as taking the forms of cats or owls or toads or spiders and being helpers for doing the spell casting. Well, that's one of the aspects, which seems, this seemed to be important as proof of witchcraft during the witch trials. And that's how it comes down to us in the culture of the old thing of black cats. The witch must have a black cat. And there we go. So I don't know how many of you have pets around the house.
So yes, so one of the aspects of familiar spirits is ancestors, and those would be the dead, basically. So there are different categories of the dead. There are the beloved dead, which would be your family, ancestors, people who you have loved who have passed on, and who you might celebrate or commemorate at Samhain. There's also the category of the mighty dead, which is witches who have passed on and who can help us to empower our magic. In Christianity, these are known as the cloud of witnesses, and they're very important in particularly Eastern Orthodoxy. So it's the same concept, that those of our faith who have passed on can help us and intercede for us within the spirit world in the present day. And another really important concept, which seems to be all across Europe, is the concept of the wild hunt. And the wild hunt is the idea that you have in pre-Christian times. This was led by Odin, and he would ride out from Valhalla with his mighty army of the dead on their own, whatever errands they were running. And interestingly, in India, the wild hunt is led by the god Rudra, who has a lot of very similar attributes to Odin. He's a god of the wind, and they ride out in the winter, same thing, and his army is called the Maruts, and they ride along spirit lines in the landscape. In southern Europe, the wild hunt is led by the goddess Hecate. In the Welsh borders, it's led by a guy called Wild Edric, who and his wife Lady Goda, who is basically a queen of the fairies. And the reason that Wild Edric had to lead the wild hunt was because he stopped resisting the Normans too early and had to be, he had to be put to one side in the wild hunt. Because the Christian lore of the wild hunt is that they're people who are not bad enough to go to hell, but not good enough to get into heaven, so they're in an intermediate state. Obviously, as pagans, we don't tend to believe in heaven and hell, so that's kind of irrelevant. But it's interesting that there's a continuity between the ancient pagan and indeed Hindu ideas about the wild hunt into the Christian era. Another very important category of the dead is psychopomps, and these would be, sometimes they're the dead or sometimes they're deities that lead you into the land of the dead when you die. So, for example, the god Anubis in Egyptian mythology is a psychopomp. Another important category of spirit would be land wights or landvetir, and these are the Norse equivalent of the genius loci, the spirit of place, and they so they can help in our magic. The genius loci comes from the Roman terminology for a spirit of place. Then we have the fair folk or the fairies. Now this is a huge topic that could give us a whole new talk, but the fair folk are sometimes conceived as nature spirits, and sometimes they're seen as a category of the dead. Also, the category that's not good enough to get to heaven, not bad enough to go to hell. So there's different folklore about who the fair folk are and what their purpose is. But suffice it to say that some of them are friendly to humans and some of them are not. So when you're dealing with the fair folk, it's best to be very polite and very cautious. And then two of my favourite categories of weird supernatural creatures, etins and woodwoses. And an etin is an old English word for giants, and there's lots of folklore about giants all over England. And then a woodwose is basically a green man. It's a man who has gone into the woods and become green, and symbolizes the natural man, which in Christianity was regarded as, you know, the embodiment of sin. But in paganism, we're like, woohoo, natural man, that sounds good. So take your pick. Okay. So one of the themes that's run through this presentation is the desire to try to control events. And back in the day, before there was scientific instruments to measure the weather, and before there was you know, modern medicine to control illness and all that sort of thing. And of course, now that we are floored by the coronavirus, we suddenly remember what it was like to not have all the answers to everything. And of course, back in the day of feudalism, when there was no democracy, or democracy was only for a very small number of the aristocracy, the aspect of magic involving resisting tyranny was really, really important. And of course, we can see that having a resurgence now, in that people are using magic to resist Trump and other right-wing governments. So magic is perennially used to resist tyrants. And oh, there we go. So in case you didn't guess, this is a picture of Aradia from the Gospel of the Witches. And one of the things that she is purported to have said is, "And thou shalt be the first of witches known, and thou shalt be the first of all in the world, and thou shalt teach the art of poisoning those who are great lords of all. Yes, thou shalt make them die in their palaces, and thou shalt bind the oppressor's soul with power. And when ye find a peasant who is rich, then ye shall teach the witch your pupil how to ruin all his crops with tempests dire, with lightning and with thunder terrible, and the hail and wind." And, you know, this sounds unduly harsh to our modern ears, but when you think back to, you know, the oppressive conditions of feudalism, you can understand how people could get that vengeful. And, you know, people are currently invoking and working with Aradia to, as I said, resist the tyranny, to promote Black Lives Matter, and to, you know, to resist the homophobia and transphobia that's being promoted by the Trump regime. So yes,
oppression,
they're fighting oppression.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Which then takes us on to our next one.
Yes.
Well, the solidarity. This will be our final slide, and then we will be wrapping this up and looking for questions. So the solidarity, I found this part absolutely fascinating, because it's where popular culture and people coming together meets magic and the forming of fraternities. Now, this folk magic, as we've already said, was the realm of the dispossessed, those without any power to wield. So in solidarity, there is strength. And as trade unions and guilds began to form, fraternities among their practitioners also began to form, many using elaborate initiation ceremonies involving blindfolds and ordeals, secret oaths of membership, a metaphorical death and rebirth ceremony. Any Masons out there will find that very familiar. Some of these fraternities included the plowmen, the gardeners, the foresters, the millers, the drovers, and the Masons. Each would have their own mystical backstory, their own trade secrets, their own handshakes, and means of identifying and verifying membership of other members. The one I'd like to take a look at, an example of today, is the confraternity of the plow. Now, plowing with horses became very important during this time period, which is the leading up into the 1700s towards the 1800s. Members were apprenticed from a very young age, and upon reaching the age of 21, they could be initiated as full members of the society. This meant that they could learn the horseman's secret signs, tokens, and words. While it is common knowledge that a trained horseman had extraordinary abilities to work with horses, his secrets aroused suspicion, and that power gave sway over his employers. Some started saying the ceremonies involved a secret handshake with the devil, from whom they derived their power, and some linked the horseman with the toad bone ritual, which is something important in folk magic, but it's another whole story which we won't get into. It's something for you to read up on. Which was said that would give them magic ability over horses. There are stories of the Lord of the Manor coming out and the horseman standing in front, and the horse would automatically sit down. And the Lord would say, "Let me pass." And he'd go, "You can pass if you want," but the horse wouldn't stand up until he got what he wanted. And then he would go, "Okay," and motion to the horse would get up and leave. So yes, that did give them very good powers. So did the horsemen actually use magic? Well, some of the stories are impressive, like the one I just mentioned. However, when you give the common folk a little bit of power, what normally happens? Well, in this case, it was the 1799 Unlawful Societies Act that Parliament enacted in England, or Britain, I guess, which came down hard on them, prohibiting the taking of unlawful oaths by any members of a secret organization, except the Masons and the Orangemen, who were likely already involved in government by that point. The act was also used to target the early trade unions, which a good example would be
The Tall Puddle Martyrs.
Exactly, who were sent to Australia. That was one of the things. If you were proven to be a member of a secret organization and you took a secret oath, you could be transported, which usually meant a 7-year sentence in Australia and, yes, North America too. Because of this, most of the organizations went underground, but that didn't stop the stories of their magical abilities from spreading. Artifacts have been found with inscribed, have the names of the old gods. There was one picture in one of the books that showed the word name Baal written on something. And they were using Theban writing. So the ordinary people would have no clue what they'd written. But if you were trained in it and recognized it, you could read what it said. So really what we've done today is an overview. It's been a very scattershot thing, giving you little pieces of what is involved in folk magic. Now, I'm sure you've written down things that are interesting to you. Well, then that's what you can look into, because it is such a broad category, a broad spectrum of things, because it's throughout our culture, throughout our folk history. All these things come out.
But the unifying thread of the whole thing is what we were trying to draw together, which is the fact that people back in the day didn't have much power in society, so they turned to magic, and they didn't have much power over nature, so they turned to magic to try to fill that gap, and also that people used it to resist oppression, and that naturally led into the solidarity. Resisting oppression naturally leads to the solidarity of these fraternities and magical orders.
And the Act of 1799 put it underground.
Yeah.
So that's why it was only certain people would know about it, or it would be passed down through families or passed down through organizations. And it was only in, when was the witchcraft?
1951.
Yes, the Witchcraft Act was repealed, that it suddenly became of interest again.
Yes, or more widely available.
Yes, yes.
Yep.
So going to put the further reading slide up a bit. I'm going to move that over there just in case it helps. So some of the works consulted have been Nigel Pennick, definitely
worth the read.
very well worth a read, and very knowledgeable guy. And in fact, the reason why there's a conference in the UK. So if you're in the UK, look up the Nameless Art Conference, which is a fantastic event, and it's basically a bunch of people get together to talk about folk magic and folkloric witchcraft, who were inspired by. Ultimately, they were inspired by the works of Nigel Pennick, I believe. So
he's from Cambridge.
Yeah.
And has been researching this a long time.
Yeah. Also, we mentioned the Book of English Magic, which is an interesting read, and the work of Barbara Rietti on the folklore of Newfoundland.
For people on this side of the pond.
Yeah, if you're on this side of the pond, that is an essential read. And the excellent Sigil Witchery by Laura Tempest Dackroff, highly recommended, and there's lots of lovely exercises in that, so I got really creative and enjoyed that one. And Edith Folk, the appropriately named Edith Folk, and her Folklore of Canada.
And one thing we didn't cover, because it is such a big topic, would be Appalachian folk magic.
Yes.
So any of our viewers down in the States, there's an area for you to look into, because a lot of what we've been talking about today was transported over to North America and grew from there when it arrived.
And wherever you are in the world, there will be folk magic local to you that you can find out about.
Where there are people, there is folk magic.
This is very true. There you go. So we will now happily open it up to questions.
Yes. Okay, let me just stop sharing the screen.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
There we go. And gallery view. There we go.
That's better.
Actually, I should do. Well.
No, that's fine.
Okay. I mean, as I said, there was a lot there. So.
Yeah.
There was indeed. Thank you very much indeed for that, Bob and Yvonne. Most interesting. Okay, do we have any questions?
I do have a question, actually.
Okay,
Thank you. First of all, that was really fascinating. I really enjoyed that, because it's I'm really starting afresh here with the whole pagan side of things. So it's really interesting to hear the history. But I've got school-age children, one of which is just studying her A-levels and had done religious education for her GCSEs. And I found it really strange that she wasn't allowed to touch on any pagan or Wicca or witchcraft in her studies.
Wow.
So it's not really a question, it's just that, well, maybe it is a question, like, why are we not allowed to allow our children to study the history of religion, really?
Yeah. Well, I was very fortunate at school in that my RE teacher was an atheist, and so he taught us about polytheism, animism, Islam and Judaism, and it was quite an eye-opener, I can tell you. But that was longer ago, sometime in the 1980s. So depending on if you're in a C of E school, then that might be why there's a restriction on it.
That's on the head and the deputy.
Well, yes, it does. If you you actually have a right to your child to be educated in, but they will probably get it wrong anyway. So there you go.
Well,
But also, I was going to say, what you do is you approach your local SACRE, which is the Standing Advisory Committee on Religious Education, and make a noise.
Because one of the former heads of the PF in England or the UK was actually an RE teacher from London.
Yeah.
So those were interesting talks, because I'm a teacher as well. So.
Yeah, Mike Steigel from so get in touch with the Pagan Federation as well. They will definitely back you up on that one.
And Kevin Groves may want to say something a little bit about the Pagan Symposium work with religious education.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Okay. Mike, Jay and I were involved as part of the symposium of doing the beginnings of an RE curriculum for GCSE some years back. Well, maybe 2 or 3 years back. There is an outline that teachers can use. It's on a site called reonline.org.uk, I think. The symposium website has the details, and Mike has them, and so do I, and I think the symposium as a whole does. We are working towards a GCSE for RE in paganism.
Wow.
Excellent.
That's fantastic.
That's amazing.
Yeah, brilliant.
I work I'm a teacher in Reading, and I don't really say that I'm a pagan, but however, I do listen to what they do for RE, and I am very interested. And RE in our school is taught so badly that it's actually not worth teaching at all. And the amount of times that they're actually, teaching time, they're allotting it to it is about an hour a week. And then we don't even run a GCSE anymore. And so the thought of changing the RE curriculum is absolutely huge. Now, I do know in Cornwall they changed it a bit. It is now part of their law or part of their curriculum that they do teach paganism. But in this area, it's very, very badly taught.
Well,
Yeah,
my
it's
son's school,
pretty patchy.
My son's school, his is fairly progressive. They purposely wanted to avoid mainstream and go off road. And my son came home one day and said, "We talked about paganism, and I talked at length about the Green Man, and everybody was in awe."
That's fantastic.
So it's changing. It's down to the teachers.
Oh, very
If they
much
can
so.
manage it.
But yeah, I mean, any of you who actually have some spare time and it's, you know, get yourself onto your local sacre, because that is a good lead. Although I did this, it entailed suffering because it was a committee meeting and it was dull. But if you can get onto your local sacre, then you know you can wave the flag, so to speak. So yeah. Okay, we have a question about animism, which I can't. Hang on, I'll have to open the chat. Let me see. I have just done religion, from Caroline Dixon. I have just done religion as one of the aspects of my open degree, and we did cover animism, but still the main world religions were key features, and I'm coming in here and learning heaps more. Yes.
Yes, I noticed I had to do RE lessons as part of when I was doing primary work, and I noticed that most of them were, well, let's look at this religion compared to Christianity, and then we'll look at this religion compared to Christianity.
Yeah.
So that was the template that all others were judged on.
Yes.
And
if you go, you know, if you're going to judge any religion, you have to look at it on its. You have to judge it on its own criteria and its own internal paradigm, and not on a different paradigm that's completely alien to it. So, any questions about folk magic?
May I ask a question?
About RE, but
Yes.
you know, yeah.
Kate F, I think, had one.
Please, could I just ask a little more about the clog almanac, please? I was wondering whether it was you did it once and it was reusable, or whether it was a diary of a certain year, and whether you just took a chance that the year you made it was the correct one, or whether you had to calibrate it, or how they combine, that kind of thing. So if you have a strange year like ours where the summer is early, would you end up planting all your crops the wrong way from then onwards?
Well, bearing in mind that the climate would have been a lot more stable in the past. And well, yes, not all the time, but anyway, from once the little ice age of the 1400s was over, then hopefully the climate had stabilized a bit. So, well, the first thing about a clog almanac is that it's a perpetual calendar, so it doesn't have the days it doesn't have the days of the week marked on it. It's just the days of the year and the festivals, the relevant festival. So like say it's Beltane, right, or it's Midsummer, or St. John's Eve, or Lady Day, or any one of a number of traditional festivals. So there's a traditional piece of weather lore I'm from Hampshire, and in Hampshire and possibly all over England, we have a saying that if it rains on St. Swithin's Day, it will rain for another 40 days. And this is because when St. Swithin was buried, he specifically said he wanted to be buried outside in the churchyard. And they were like, oh no, but he was really saintly, we should put him inside the church. And so he made it rain for 40 days, and then they relented and put him outside. because he was making it rain.
That's a lovely bit of revenge.
Yes. So anyway, the point is of the clog almanac is that you, sorry, that was a massive digression, wasn't it? You get your clog almanac, you mark the festivals on it, and then possibly in your magical diary in another place you go, on St. Swithin's Day it was dry, so I expect it to not rain for the next 40 days. Or on St. Swithin's Day it was wet, so I expect it to rain for the next 40 days. And then you check to see if your prediction came true.
Like the Farmer's Almanac that's been published now for a couple centuries.
Like, similarly, there's a piece of folklore in England that you can't eat blackberries after September the 29th because the devil has spat on them. So I don't know how
the dogs.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't eat the ones below Great Dane height either.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, the blackberries do indeed not taste as nice after that time. And interestingly, September the 29th was also a festival of Odin. So there you go. Anyway, so there's a traditional festival that's used as a marker for a natural phenomenon, and that's the idea behind clog almanacs.
Lovely. We've got a question from, got a question from Chaz Roberts. Wanted to ask a question about superstitions.
Okay.
Are you still there?
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Bob and Yvonne. I'm just wondering about this one because when I was brought up, in our family, there was a lot of superstitions quoted, but seriously taken. And I'll give you one example. You may know this one, but it was if you couldn't look at the moon through glass.
Yes, I've heard that.
If we did as children, if we did as a child, we were taken outside in the garden and we had to bow to the moon and turn around 3 times.
Oh.
And I was just, like it, but it was this was serious, and we did it, and I still, think about that even now. I mean, I was at crumbs of windows. There's a glass pane there in the moon, and
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering
through these things.
Well, there you go. But this one, these sort of, there's a lot of superstitions, isn't there? Do they all emanate from something sort of logical that happened to people, like walking behind a ladder and all that thing, or was there sort of, were they created deliberately to, I don't know, to control in some way, or how did they sort of come back?
I think both, and a mixture.
So the meanings got diluted. Or,
well, the thing about the moon one, I would have said, was that there's a thing in. I mean, the Bible is a very rich source of pagan customs, in that it keeps going around telling people not to do certain things. So we know that there were people with pagan tendencies doing these things, and the Bible's telling them off, right? So one of them is that you kiss your hand to the new moon, right?
Yes.
And I think that the not seeing the new moon through glass thing is related to that, because there must have been some vestigial custom that you had to go outside and greet the moon. And if you did it, and you had to do it outside,
yes,
and therefore it's bad luck to see the moon from inside.
You did.
Yeah. I mean, that one is, I have never actually met anyone who actually had that as part of their family lore, so thank you for sharing. That's really good. It's in a book called Dictionary of Superstitions by Iona and Peter Opie. Sorry,
okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say the way it kind of came about is because I lived in Guernsey, but because my mum was trapped over there during the occupation, and she worked in the local psychiatric hospital, and her friend was from Ripon in North Yorkshire. And when the war ended, this lady had nowhere to go, and my mother said, "Did you want to come and live with us?" We had a big old-fashioned 300-year-old farmhouse, and she said, "Well, you've done some great stuff, really been helpful, and come and live with us." So I was sort of like, whilst my mother was doing work, but I also had, there was this older lady from North Yorkshire sort of way, and she had a lot of these. It was her that had a lot of these traditions, and she was sort of like, it wasn't taken lightly. This serious, you know. So I don't know whether maybe it's a more northerny. It may just because she was from further up, whether that's got something to do with it.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean,
deadly serious about it.
fascinating. You should write those down.
Definitely.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So-
think in answer to your question, I think both. Both and you know, like sometimes one, sometimes the other. Because the one about the ladder, it's kind of common sense not to walk under a ladder in case somebody drops something on your head, right? So.
Yeah. But I suppose I was just thinking, like some of the folk magic, in a sense, was based on controlling, isn't it? You know, I can see that a lot of that was sort of like, you know, and a way of life in a way, isn't it, to keep you on the straight road.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I suppose could be social control. Yeah.
We've got a comment here from Richard Levy saying, in Judaism, you used to greet the new moon.
Ah, interesting.
That would go back a long way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you fill us in a little on that, Richard, about the new moon greeting?
Well, there's various things. The moon is actually there's loads of things, including full-on rituals and blessings for the moon. There's one actually in the Talmud. It's a ritual that is, I think, if it's meant to ensure good fortune, and it's actually just called in the translation "blessing of the new moon." It's difficult because I think a lot of people have the misconception that Jewish magic is Kabbalah, which is 13th, 14th century Spanish stuff, which certainly is part of it. But there's pre-Kabbalistic magic and mysticism from both Hebrew Bible, Talmud, Makkavar, and things like that. So that's going on for centuries. But yeah, the new moon is particularly actually given quite a lot of attention, from both rituals to blessings to prayers. And things like, it's actually very much linked to Shekinah. So the divine presence of God being female, and of course the moon as well, is quite significant for a lot of pagans.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yes, I mean, the thing is that what you've got to remember about the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible is that there are different tendencies of different groups having a fight. So there was the people who were much more the magical and mystical bent, and then there were 3 or 4 different tendencies within that were all putting their ideas in there. So you can't take it as definitive of. You certainly can't take it as definitive of modern Judaism in any way. Just to mention that.
Evelyn, what's next?
Yeah, it was said to the moon could actually also be used for apotropic magic against demonic forces as well.
Right, because it's the light, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that, Richard. So we got a question thing here from Jackie Clapperton saying that when my father was young and at sea, they had a prediction game to predict the initials of their future wives by putting a key in between the pages of the Bible and reciting the alphabet until the key turned by itself under your fingers. Until his dying day, my father swore that it predicted my mother's initials. Christian folk magic?
Yeah. Pretty much, yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, I was also going to mention at some point, but it didn't come up, that most of the people who were doing these magical techniques during the Middle Ages and more recently would all have been at least nominally Christian and sometimes devoutly Christian. So, you know, folk magic obviously goes back to the pagan times, but it also was practiced by ordinary people in general, and they would have been church-going folk because it was compulsory to go to church. And I've met Christian witches, like my ex-husband's auntie was very psychic, and she had a bunch of friends that she would meet up with, and they would do basically witchcraft. So they do exist.
But doing things like divination, finding out what the baby's sex will be, that sort of thing. People would still do that because their parents or their mother taught them. and the grandmother had done it as well. So it was acceptable within the family.
Yeah.
Just
Well, the thing is,
Yep.
you've got to remember, although the church has always officially been against this sort of thing, you don't really get a mass awareness of that you know, Christians aren't supposed to do this stuff until after the evangelical revival in the late 19th century. I think people would have been cheerfully doing bibliomancy and all kinds of stuff, and whatever else came to hand, because they didn't know they weren't supposed to.
Yeah. Okay, it's what are we at now? Nearly 9 o'clock. Do we have any more questions? If so, speak up or wave a hand or a foot or something.
semaphore.
Nope. It appears not.
Okay.
Okay, once again, Yvonne, Bob, thank you for a very fascinating talk. Be pleased to know you actually had the highest number of attendees as well.
Thank you for coming, everybody. And thank you to Julie and Emlyn for organising, and Emlyn for ably hosting. And thank you all
Thank
for coming.
you kindly.
Yeah, I see people from all over out there. I see somebody there
Yes.
from South America.
Indeed. We might have 2 people from South America, actually, because somebody on my Instagram said they were coming. So if you're here, hello.
Right.
Laura, are you trying to ask a question?
Is it?
We appear to be a disembodied hand on Laura's feed.
It's magical.
Yes. Yeah, so if anybody wants to ask any questions, my Instagram is Birdberry Books.
Mm-hmm.
So you can always add me on Instagram and ask me stuff.
And do keep your eyes open for the announcements about Yvonne's books going into their 2nd edition in the very near future. I thought I'd sneak that in, Yvonne.
Thank you, Emlyn. Yes. Yes, do keep an eye on the Doreen Valiente Foundation website and the Doreen
Central
Valiente
Pagan
Foundation
stuff.
Instagram feed.
Yep.